morning. I'm your host this morning, Terence Corrigan, and welcome to everybody who's joining us from wherever you may be hailing from for the launch of another of our Blueprint for Growth papers. We at the Institute of Race Relations have identified economic growth as the most pressing challenge facing South Africa, and these papers are intended to set out what needs to be done in discrete areas. Now, today, I'm joined by Gabriel Crouse, head and founder of IRR Legal, one of our affiliate bodies, who will be taking us through a matter that I'm sure is close to many of our hearts, and that is tax. It's often said there are two things that one can never escape from: death and taxes. And sadly, sometimes those things are not all that far apart. I think that I speak for a great many South Africans of all socioeconomic backgrounds when I say that there is a discernible sense of frustration at the fact that we turn over sometimes as much as 30 or 40% of our incomes, and often feel like we get very, very little for it. More than that, we pay these tax bills, and many of us wonder whether we are actually investing in a country, or merely keeping an impersonal and sometimes less than competent state afloat. Those of you who may be wondering why my lighting is somewhat subdued, well, I'm dealing with precisely one of those issues right now. Since the early hours of this morning, we have been afflicted by a power outage. Sadly, in Johannesburg, the commercial capital of South Africa, such things are not unusual. Right. So Gabriel will be taking us through some proposals and some analysis of what South Africa's tax picture looks like, and what can be done practically to start redirecting some of that tax spend. More importantly, I think, or equally importantly, is how can we actually bring that burden down? And with that, Gabriel, over to you. I'm going to ask everybody who has any questions or comments to put them in the comment section. And when Gabriel's finished with his presentation, we'll return to that, and there'll be some time for fielding some questions. With that, Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Terence. How's it? Greetings to everyone. So yeah, we'll go through this briefing quickly, and then we'll field some questions. The basic idea is to cut VAT and BEE premiums. The occasion for this is the budget speech, which is coming up next week. And that's an opportunity that comes around once a year for the Treasury to really set the agenda for what's to come in rands and cents. And our pitch is that, there are real achievable goals in the short run in the next year that would help ordinary South Africans. And the twin ways of doing this is, one is to cut VAT, value added tax, and the other is to cut BEE premiums, which are on the spending side, on the government procurement side. This will be fairly familiar to some people. There's some new stuff peppered in here in some ways. The idea is as old as time, because really the idea is to get value for money out of taxpayer revenue. So let's get into it. The overview looks like this. We're going to look at the popularity of cutting tax. Is South Africa in a place where this is politically appealing? We're going to look at the value for money versus left-right ideological gridlock problem, which is going to make sense once you see the popularity issue. We will look at the popularity of cutting BEE premiums. Bear in mind, Sono address last week, President Ramaphosa put a big question mark behind BEE for the first time in its history. The president's done that. Political dysfunction. We're going to, again, it's sort of like the ideological tension is going to make sense once you've seen some of the popularity polling data. Then we'll just do a simple focus on VAT, few numbers, focus on BEE premium, a little bit of data there, a little bit of authoritative sources, and then some value for money data, where value for money is kind of taking both the function of like well, how much is the government spending and what is it really getting for its spend? And that's the underlying idea, is that all of these ideological problems, both at the tax level and at the BEE level, kind of get resolved if you focus on the value for money issue. Okay, so here we go. First, we've got the popularity of cutting taxes. We're going to look at two main polls. One is from Afrobarometer from a couple of years ago. And the first real tax question that I could find really in the record was, do you think that the amount of taxes that ordinary people in South Africa are required to pay to the government is too little, too much, or about the right amount? And this kind of question gets asked around the world, and a lot of places, the vast majority say, well, depending on the country, sometimes they say, people are not getting taxed enough. It needs to go up. Sometimes people say they're getting taxed too much. What do they say in South Africa? Only 16% say that tax is too little on ordinary South Africans. About 36%, roughly a third, say the tax level is about right. And 48% say that the tax level is too much. Ordinary people are being taxed too much. So that shows nearly a majority, a plurality. The most popular answer is to say that the tax level is too high. Then there's a separate question that focuses on rich people. Do you think that the amount of taxes that the rich people in South Africa are required to pay is too little, too much, or about right? And there's a shift, and it's kind of a predictable shift. Here, only a third say too little. Roughly a third say the amount is about right. And those who say it's too much have come down from 48% to 22%. So there's still some who think it's too much, but it's significantly fewer. In fact, it's as simple as that. The most popular answer here is too little, but it's within a margin of error. So the about right and the too little are roughly tied. Whereas here, on ordinary South Africans, the most popular answer is clearly too much. And the connection to VAT is obviously that VAT is the tax that is the most regressive. In other words, it falls the most heavily on poor people relative to rich people. And so if you're looking to cut a tax that's going to be popular to cut, VAT is going to be the most appealing one. If you want to cut corporate tax, estate duties, if you have millions of rands and you pass away and you hand them over to your children, there are, if you have a high enough estate, there are tax implications there. But that's in the zone where not that many people think it's too much. Whereas if you look at ordinary taxes and VAT falls on everyone every time they buy anything, that's where the most popular answer by far is to say the tax level is too high. So in summary, the most popular option is to say that this is a little bit wrong. The most popular option is to say that tax overall is too high on ordinary people. So the next polling question comes from the Social Research Foundation. This asked if, a year or two ago, asked if a future coalition government, do you prefer a future coalition to reduce taxes and instead focus on creating an environment where large and small businesses can more easily invest and create jobs, or a future coalition that increases taxes so that it increases the money available for the government to spend on service delivery? Now, this is an either or. You're, as a survey organization, creating a binary. You're saying you can only choose A or B. You can only have chocolate or vanilla. You can only have, peanut butter and jam, or you can have Bovril and butter on your toast. You can't mix those things together. And some people kind of sometimes worry about creating those binaries and asking people these questions. We will get into why we think that this is a very fair binary, why this is really the situation that South Africa is in. But before getting into that detailed argument, let's just first look at what the results are. When people got this question, most people were happy to answer this question. And the results are overwhelming. On the reduced side, strongly, people ask, do you strongly prefer the first one, or you just generally prefer the first one, or do you agree with the second statement or strongly agree with the second statement? So if we look at the first one, reduce taxes and focus on creating jobs and so on, 65%, 65.8%, that's really 2/3, strongly agreed with this first statement to reduce taxes. and another 8% agreed with it. So overall, that's around 74%. That's nearly 3/4 agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. And then if you look at the second statement, you want to increase taxes so that we can increase service delivery. Only 3.2% agreed with the increase and 20% strongly agreed with it. So you've got about 23.2% going for the second statement. Now, the troubling thing is that taxes have, in practical terms, increased in every budget for, roughly speaking, the last 16 years. So it's like this 20% has really been running the country, which doesn't seem very democratic. And part of the way that it increases, just for your detail, is that if you look at income tax, which is the largest single tax by revenue, even if the tax rates are kept the same, if the brackets aren't adjusted, you've got bracket creep because of inflation. And that has, the data on the bracket creep has been astonishing. And of course, you've got like all kinds of excise taxes that increase constantly and so on. And VAT itself went up a few years ago, and it nearly went up again last year. So this 20% has been running the country. And last year, for the first time, there was an effort to increase taxes in a considerable way that didn't work out. So taxes didn't reduce. The 74% didn't get what they want, but at least this 20% wasn't getting what they want. There was kind of like a split down the middle here. Okay, so this creates a strange question. Like, if we live in a democracy, which we do, and you can vote for parties, why is it the case that you've got 74% who want to reduce or who agree with reducing taxes or strongly agree with reducing taxes in order to grow the economy, and yet no political party is doing that, is arguing for that, is really trying that? And I think that a good way to think about this is the Fukuyama framework. It's already been introduced. Goes back to Francis Fukuyama, one of the world's most renowned classical liberals, who came to speak at WITS before COVID. And I'm sort of summarizing how he presented a way of thinking about the world to do with tax. And he put it in, there's this sort of 4-part quadrant. One question is, do you want less tax or do you want more tax? And another question is, do you want more effective government or do you want less effective government? Now, almost everyone in a sense wants less tax. And almost everyone in a sense wants more effective government. And what's that sense? It's like, well, if you could spend less tax and still get more effective government, then everyone wants that, excepting for the most extreme left-leaning ideologues. So Fukuyama's idea is that everyone can agree that this quadrant is a great option. Less taxes for a more effective government. Everyone wants that. And likewise, everyone can agree that this is a terrible option, where you've got more tax, but you're getting a less effective government. Like, whether you're a left-winger or a right-winger, that just seems terrible. Now, in the gray zone, you've got this sort of Cold War style debate between the sort of right-wing monarchists who say, look, we want less tax, and that's the most important thing. So even if we get a less effective government, even if there's no more public parks, even if the police take longer to answer their phones, whatever it is, we're willing to suffer with less effective government. We'll use our own money to hire private security, to make our gardens look pretty, whatever it is. We're willing to suffer whatever suffering there might be with a less effective government if it means we spend less tax. And so that's the sort of right-wing monarchist line. It's leaning all the way to zero in terms of size of government. And then on the left wing, it's like, well, we want to spend more tax to get more effective government. We know more tax is taking money out of our pockets, and we don't really like that, but it's so worth it to get more effective government, even if it means we run out of money, we can't afford our own gardens, even if it means that we can't afford, to protect ourselves in any way. We're happy to be fully reliant on the government. If the government can do everything for us, that's great. We'll go all the way to 100% tax if the government's going to take care of 100% of our problems. And both of those positions are kind of hard to argue with in a way, because the people who hold those positions sort of have this preference set, and they have their idea about what the good trade-off is. So when you're here, people will debate endlessly. But when you're here, it's like everyone should agree we need to change things. And if you're here, it's like, well, everyone should agree this is a really good option. And Fukuyama's thought is, if you're in this quadrant where you're spending more tax and you're getting less government, the first thing you have to do is surely reduce the tax burden. Because the idea that you're going to keep adding more tax and shift from here to here can't make sense. Because if you're in this zone where you're spending more tax and getting less effective government, that must mean there's something deeply corrupt and flawed in the system that you've got, because no reasonable person would ever want this. And so the first thing you have to do is kind of deprive that corrupt system of oxygen, is redirect some resources on the margins back towards normal people who aren't going to be spending in this crazy way where, the more you spend, the worse it is. Instead, in their own lives, they'll be spending, the more we spend, the better it is for ourselves, at least. And once you've kind of normalized yourself in this position, you then can kind of oscillate between these two while aiming for this one. Or, maybe you need to grow the state for a little while. Okay, so to connect that might sound kind of abstract, and forgive me for the puppy barking outside. But I think I can make that seem really commonsensical, what's just been said, by looking at Afrobarometer's data. So Afrobarometer, remember, earlier found that roughly half of people said that taxes are too high on ordinary South Africans. Then they asked, do you agree with this statement? It is better to pay higher taxes if it means that there will be more services provided by the government. And here 53% agreed with that. And then the second statement, it is better to pay lower taxes even if that means there will be fewer services provided by the government. 40% agreed with that. So what's going on here is when you have the word if, you're kind of asking people this sort of hypothetical question. Well, if there's more tax and you get more effective government, would you be here? Or if there's less tax and you get less effective government, would you be here? And this hypothetical kind of splits South Africans in quite a different way to the question, do you think tax is too high? And in particular, in the way that comes out of the Social Research Foundation question, where you ask, do you want to cut tax? No ifs, no hypotheticals. Like here we have the hypothetical, which could apply to South Africa at a later time or at an earlier time or to another country. But in reality, in our reality, do you want to cut taxes now? This next government coming in, do you want to reduce taxes or increase taxes? There you see a huge result saying, no, we want to reduce taxes. So I think that shows, like the fact that you've got this 50-40 split on do you prefer to be here or here in abstract, but right now, do you want to cut taxes? You've got 3/4 saying cut taxes. I think that shows that most South Africans think we are in this position where even if they ideally would like more tax for more effective government, they just don't think that's a realistic option. And so right now they think we should have less tax for a less, even if that means restricting the government. And that's another way of saying South Africa's middle, the swing group in the middle, around 30-40%, those seem to be typical Fukuyama type classical liberals, whose idea really is not this kind of ideological idea of I always want more effective government for more tax, or I always want less effective government for less tax. No, their core idea is I want value for money out of my tax. So right now in South Africa, I'm not getting value for money. I'm in this bad quadrant. And so I want to reduce the tax burden because we're just not getting value for money. And that value for money judgment, it's not a universal judgment. It's not like no matter what, wherever we are, I want less tax or more tax. It's like, no, in this context, given how much we're getting for this money, that's how I make my decision. It's a sort of post-Cold War, empirical, and as I say, classical liberal way of thinking about it because it's based on facts on the ground rather than on just an abstract preference. That seems to be how most people think. It's actually quite commonsensical to think like that. So the next point is we've talked about tax a lot. Now the other side is BE premiums. The IRR poll, we've run these a couple of times. This is the more recent one. The government spends over R1 trillion per year buying goods and services. How should it decide who to buy from? This is the question. Ask people in the poll, and then you give 3 options. And the first option is the government should buy on a value for money basis, making sure to buy the best product from any company at the best price without overpaying. And the second option is the government should buy on a value for money basis, making sure to buy the best product at the best price. If 2 companies are tied, the black-owned company should get the contract. And then the third option is the government should buy more from black-owned companies, even if that means paying more and getting less value for money. So this is the current system under the Public Procurement Policy Framework Act. These are 2 alternative systems. And you ask people and you see, what do they prefer? Well, 54% in the latest poll preferred value for money straight. 28% preferred value for money with a racial tiebreak, and only 17% preferred paying BEE premiums. So remember earlier I was saying, like, if you look at increased tax, that was only 20. And here it's like pay BEE premiums, it's 17. But this is the group, this is the small minority that has been running the country, because as acting Treasury Chief Procurement Officer Vili Matebula has repeatedly said to IRR Legal and in public fora, we pay BEE premiums. That's what the law requires. In fact, the BEE premiums are nominally capped at 25%. So if you've got 1.2 trillion, if you were paying up to the cap, you'd be paying around 250 billion rand in BEE premiums. Now, we're not paying 250 billion rand in premiums, but that is what the law allows for. And in fact, the law has subsequently been amended to make the cap go away so that you can pay even more for BEE premiums. So most people really do not want this. I mean, this is a huge majority. It's over 80% want value for money, either with or without the racial tiebreak. It's only 17% who want the BEE premiums, and yet this is the system that we have. So this points to major political dysfunction. No political party proposes serious tax and spend reduction, even though 73% of respondents given the SRF framing prefer that. No political party has seriously contributed to cutting out BEE premiums, even though every party in the GNU has a way to remove BEE premiums practically by requesting exemptions on all spending within their departments. And you can go through all of the parties, DA, IFP, FF+, PA, ANC. None of those parties has actually done anything about removing BEE premiums, even though over 80% of people want that. The ANC has doubled down on BEE preference premiums through the Public Procurement Act amendment, which it's passed but is not yet being implemented. And the DA is doubling down on preference premiums through its private members bill. And we discussed this in a briefing last year. But they say instead of paying preference premiums for BEE, you should pay preference premiums for UN social development goals. So like, if a company plants trees on paper and does, you can pay an extra 25% for that company to sell you laptops or whatever it is, if you're a government procurement officer. It's really the same thing. They've just substituted out race for United Nations goals. And in some ways, they've actually made it worse because of how they changed the numbers. In principle, you can pay 66% extra on the DA's preference premium system. So it's like really no one in Parliament seems to be pushing seriously for the kind of reforms that we're talking about. Cut BEE premiums to zero, 83%, 81% want that, and cut VAT. 48% say tax on ordinary people is too high, and roughly 80% say that we should reduce taxes if that means increasing jobs, and cutting VAT is a very reliable and simple way to do that. So if we just look at the numbers on VAT, if you reduced VAT from 15% to 11.5%, sorry, this should be a percentage point. It just turned into a 5. But if you do that, you will save 100 billion rand based on Treasury data, 100 billion rand every year that stays in the pockets of ordinary South Africans rather than being extracted into the fisc. And then you ask yourself, well, where does that actually cash out? And using international standards and looking at the kind of economy that we are, The conservative estimate is that 31 billion rand will be absorbed by businesses. And that basically means that businesses won't adjust their prices downwards. Rather, they'll keep the price where it is, and they don't have to pay as much VAT anymore, so they'll just keep more as profit. And the other 69 billion will be transferred to taxpayers in the form of reduced prices. Now, just to be very clear, some of that will be reduced prices, like overnight companies reduce prices. And in countries where VAT has been reduced by this kind of magnitude, you've often had commentators saying, oh, companies will never reduce prices. But then they do. And they often compete with advertising. It's like companies are often looking for a reason to market themselves as socially conscious. You get competitions in the meme space for attention online, in the airwaves, on radio, and so on. And saying, look, everyone knows the VAT cut is coming in 3 months' time. We are actually going to give you that money back by pulling down our prices by the commensurate amount. Check out if our competitors aren't doing that, then you can see they don't respect you so much, or whatever, however the phrasing of it goes. And yeah, for the kind of market we looked at, several indices. We found 31 billion is a pretty conservative amount. It could very well be that only 20% is absorbed by businesses and 80% is transferred back to purchasers. But even if it is 31%, it's like those businesses are also, businesses that manage to save that money are put in a position where they're less likely to go out of business. And typically, South Africa's problem is that small and medium enterprises aren't able to stay afloat because of, amongst other things, red tape and state burdens. So this would be helping those businesses. But then if we look at the 69 billion that's expected to go through to purchases in reduced costs, and let me just say, we can look at the poorest. 10% are estimated to save 1.4 billion. And this calculation was quite complicated because we took into account the zero rating. So the poorest are already saving some VAT on zero rated goods, but they'd save an additional 1.4 billion through this reduction, 2.1 billion to the next poorest 10%, 2.6 billion, and so on, going down the line. Now, the richest top 10% are going to save 27 billion, and that savings, will be translated into other spending that stimulates economic growth. They are getting the biggest chunk, but they're not getting the majority chunk. The majority chunk is actually going to the bottom 90%. And in South Africa, it's the bottom 90% that's kind of the most overlooked. And if you focus on the bottom 80%, the savings remain significant at around 35 billion. So, roughly half of what's being saved is going to the bottom 80%. 31. So, it's you could think of it simply as like 31% going to big business, around 30, let's say 40% going to the top 20%, and then another 30-ish billion going to the bottom 80%. That's the VAT focus, the BE premium focus. What's the problem with BE premiums? The problem is not who's getting paid the money. There's this terrible mistake that some right-wing commentators make of thinking like, black businesses can't do the job. That's not true. Black businesses are highly capable. I mean, there are a lot of very, very effective black-owned companies in South Africa. The problem is on the procurement side, where you have a procurement officer sitting in a small village or town, and they have to make the decision how to spend the next 20 million rand buying laptops, or how to spend the next 80 million rand buying motor vehicles for the fire department or the police department, or procuring cement and bricks for the building construction guys, whatever it is. And instead of just having the task of buying the best product at the cheapest price, which is already a difficult thing to do. If you think when you buy a laptop or a car or a house, the big purchases that you make, how time consuming and difficult is it to figure out whether you're getting a good deal? Instead of just focusing on if you're getting a good deal, they also, in addition, have to try and pursue these BEE goals. That multitasking at the pinch point of procurement is an extreme challenge that our procurement officers are evidently not up to. And I doubt that any procurement officers in the world would be up to it. So multitasking at this point facilitates state capture. Trying to do the one thing and trying to do the other thing creates the confusion that corrupt agents are then able to take advantage of. And if they steal some money at that confusing point, how can you catch them out? Because everything's so confused, you can't even tell what was supposed to happen and tell that apart from what actually did happen. Now, that's my analysis. It's also, more importantly, the analysis of the Zondo report. I've gone over this so many times, I'm not going to repeat it. It's also the analysis of the Harvard Growth Lab, the International Money Foundation, and the World Bank. The analysis is that multitasking at the pinch point of procurement facilitates state capture. All of these highly respected authoritative sources find that to be the problem. So the long-standing calculation is that the Zondo dividend that you would get out of cutting BEE premiums out is 150 billion rand per annum. Now, only 17 billion of that is estimated to be direct savings from BEE premiums, but 133 billion is indirect savings from increased corruption-busting abilities. So, just giving these poor procurement officers a simpler task means that most people, the ones who want to do well and the ones who just want to follow the crowd, will actually be incentivized to do a good job, and only the most hardened criminals will stay doing a bad job. Whereas currently, it's only the most hardened saints that actually do a good job, because those who just follow the crowd follow the bad guys, because the bad guys are doing such a good job of winning in this very confusing system. So, and this 133 billion savings, that's not imagining that South Africa is suddenly going to not be corrupt in its administration. The estimated waste in annual procurement spending is, according to Treasury itself, 30 to 40% of the procurement spend, which is about 1.2 trillion. So that's let's say like in the area of 400 billion rand per year that's being wasted. So, Terence's house would definitely not have an electricity problem if all 400 billion rand was being spent properly rather than being wasted. But we're not promising that by cutting BEE premiums, suddenly everything's going to come right. We're just saying that roughly a third of that wastage will be eliminated, creating that 133 billion in indirect savings. And maybe that's enough to get the lights back on at Terence's house. Terence, thank you for letting me use you as an example. Okay, so this is on the BEE premium focus side. But so then the next question is like, what happens if the BEE premiums go? Does that mean like suddenly a bunch of white companies are going to sell to the government? I really don't think so. If you look at the numbers coming out of the DTIC, they only surveyed part of the Treasury spend, but they said that this is representative of all procurement spend. And this is from 2018 to 2024. This is really covering a lot of ground. And they broke down the annual procurement spend by, is it going to not black-owned companies, partially black-owned companies, SOEs, or black-owned companies? And roughly half is going to black-owned companies. The next biggest chunk is going to SOEs. So, like obviously the government school and the police station have to pay Eskom for electricity. So that's kind of government to government spending. Then you've got partially black-owned companies getting around 10, 15%. And then black-owned companies getting quite a small chunk of this total lion's share of this 1.2 trillion rand every year. And the estimate is that, having had that kind of revenue stream for all these years, those companies are effective. They're ready to ride with the bicycle training wheels removed. And just to zoom in, like if we remove here, the only difference is I'm going to remove the SOEs, because it's a little bit confusing to have the SOEs here. By removing them, we're only focusing on government spend into the private sector. And when you look at that, you see that the majority of black-owned companies really are the overwhelming majority. It's about 68% is going to majority black-owned companies. The DTIC even has data on 100% black-owned companies, which are something like 40%. So, those companies are very, very well established. So when BEE premiums are removed, The idea is not that it's going to go from black-owned companies supplying the government to white-owned companies supplying the government. Rather, the idea is that you go from a system where it's mainly black-owned companies supplying the government, but also some white-owned companies and whatever, to a system where it's roughly the same share racially. The big change is not racial. The big change is in terms of price. Suddenly, all of the companies have to compete without any premiums, either for United Nations goals like the DA's planting trees thing, or for ANC racial goals, like which company has the most whatever of whatever race. Instead, it's you just focus on price, and that starts bringing the price down of laptops or mops or ladders or whatever it is that the government is trying to buy. So, we think this is a good idea because we think value for money is the key notion. We think there's not value for money in BE premiums, and there is value for money, especially when poor people are spending. So taking the BE premiums away, putting that money in the hands back of poor people and of everyone is the best way to do it. That's the pairing. But so let's look at that value for money data. How does the data really play out in value for money? And there's one way to think about it is the fiscal multiplier. If it's above 1, then that means that for every rand the government spends, you're getting more than a rand's worth of value in the economy. And the numbers, this was published by the South African Reserve Bank as a working paper and then by an academic journal after peer review. The state spending really was helping grow the economy in 2009, 2010. Then it dropped below 1. So when you're in this gray zone, that means the government's spending a rand, it's getting like 70 cents on the rand. So it's still getting something done, but it's kind of wasting everything between here and 1. All of that, if you just left a normal person to spend a rand, when they spend a rand, you expect them to get slightly more than a rand's value add through the economy through it. So you're losing this value. And here you're losing this value. And this is quite normal. A lot of countries are here. Countries that are being really well run and growing are here. Sort of a lot of European countries, sort of stagnant countries are sort of here. And then we hit this red zone where it gets really low. And then we just hit this thing that's like, is part of the reason that this paper was circulated around the world. It's just like very hard to find anything in the world where you've got enough money to do statistics. And yet you've got such a bad government that it's literally producing negative results on the margins for its spending. So this is not all government spending is negative, but it's saying on the margins, the last rand that's being spent literally it would have been better to set it on fire than for the government to spend it. And that's sort of where it stays in 2019. Then a separate study published by the United Nations University Wider Group, authors, these are the authors, they found that on a range of different ways of analyzing multipliers, we found that resources spent through government decision-making processes in South Africa are net negative on both individual components of GDP and on the aggregate. And again, this was like a cross-method way of looking at fiscal multipliers. So really, this is a way of saying like you're not getting value for money in a traditional way of looking at it. But I think this is, this is good for economists and people who read. If you go and read the whole paper, it's kind of interesting. But I think for a lot of people, this is not so satisfying because it's like a bit of a black box. Like, how was this really calculated? You don't know unless you can do multivariable calculus and read a differences regression analysis. And not everyone can do that. Not everyone has the time to do that. So there's a more commonsensical way to look at the value for money thing. We're going to build this graph. It's going to take 3 steps. Step 1 is let's look at government effectiveness. Percentile rank. This is coming from the World Bank publishes this data. Worldwide Governance Indicators, it's called. It's been going for a very long time. South Africa starts fairly high up in the 90s and slips down. And right now is on the 40th percentile. That means 60% of countries have more effective governments than us, and 40% have worse governments than us. We can keep going down. There's a long way down to zeros over here. Things, at least there is electricity some of the time, or a lot of the time, etc., etc. If you look at the speed of that decline, we've dropped 42 percentile points in ranking over this period. That's the 3rd fastest decline on record of any countries. Only Lebanon and Puerto Rico have had worse, and Lebanon's been bombed. This is not really a country. So if you look at peaceful places that are sovereign, we are the worst. Step 2 is to look at, so, this is what are you getting when you spend the money? And then this is how much money are you spending? So one way to look at it is revenue as a percentage of GDP climbs from 20 to 25%. That's roughly a 20 percentage increase, 5 basis points increase. So revenue as a percentage of GDP has gone up quite significantly over the same period. And government expenditure as a percentage of GDP has also climbed quite significantly. And of course, this has climbed more than the revenue, and the difference is debt that we've incurred along the way, which is part of the problem. So we're taxing more, spending a lot more, getting worse, and you combine those and you get the value for money graph. And here you see the government effectiveness. We base it to 100, it falls down, and the government revenue, the amount of tax, climbs up dramatically. And this is really what you don't want. This is that bad thing I showed on the Fukuyama thing, the red zone, where you just go from, getting, I guess, decent value for your money, and then you taxing a lot more and you're getting a lot less out of it. That's much worse value for money. And then the third way to do it is we've kind of taken these numbers, we've taken all the percentile ranks, we've taken the government effectiveness ranks, and we've created the TIDE index. So this is tax increase, effectiveness decrease index, where you give a quantitative score to all countries around the world based on the intensity with which they've increased revenue and decreased effectiveness. And surprise, surprise, South Africa has the worst TIDE score on planet Earth. So we have done the worst job of moving in a tax increase, effectiveness decrease direction between 1996 and 2023. So, that kind of adds up to this thought that really we should be cutting people some slack by reducing the tax revenue burden and allowing ordinary people to spend that money instead of the government. Then just to finish off, it's like, why isn't this happening? Well, I talked about the political party story. And now, because we're coming up to budget week, let me just focus on Treasury itself. You might think it used to be the case that some people, even some self-proclaimed liberals, said, well, the system is bad, this BEE premium system, but it's actually not Treasury's fault. It's not Parliament's fault. It's the Constitution's fault. Because they said the Constitution requires BEE premiums. So we stuck with it, even though we hate it or whatever. But in fact, Treasury, in engagement with IRR Legal, conceded, it took a lot of engagement, but they conceded that cutting BEE premiums is constitutional. So you can't blame the Constitution for this issue. Leander Peterson, who's the National Treasury Director of Supply Chain Management Policy and Legal, said that BEE premiums is a policy call based on where we are currently. My statement was not that a tie break would be unconstitutional. So a tie break where there's no BEE premiums, there's no assertion that would be unconstitutional. According to Treasury, that would be constitutionally compliant. Likewise, advocate MP van Skeur in engagement said, at this stage in the country, we don't think that a tie break or BEE premium zero would suffice, but maybe in 10 or 20 years, zero BEE premiums with either a tie break or some other way of satisfying Section 217.2 would be the only tool that we need. So that's important. The Constitution is not to blame. Even according to Treasury, we could cut BEE premiums to zero. So why are they? What is going on? Well, part of the problem is that no one even knows how much BEE premiums cost. So we can't easily have this debate. Treasury's done a very good job of hiding the cost of BEE premiums since the year 2000. For 26 years, they have every single year paid BEE premiums, probably billions of rands every single year, and never once declared how much they've paid, which violates the constitutional requirement of transparency in Section 214, 215, 216, and 217 of the Constitution, which all govern Treasury's basic fiscal duties. So what Advocate MP van Skeur said, again as National Treasury legal representative, is that the Constitution requires expenditure control. She said in terms of that aspect, there is a qualification due to BEE. A qualification means you don't get as much as you want. So expenditure control, in other words, should be compromised due to BEE. Advocate van Skeur conceded that there's no previous authority for this position. It was asked in the course of the thing, and she said, yeah, well, this is what I think, but yeah, I can't say that anyone else, and this is the advice that I've given to Treasury. She's given this advice to Treasury. You don't have to worry that much about expenditure control because it's qualified. But no previous authority for that. And she did deny that there's a similar qualification of transparency. So this doesn't even really get them off the hook, but it does sort of half get them off the hook. It's a little bit confusing. So I think the upshot is that all parties in the GNU should really be taking this time to push for transparency of BEE premiums. Even if you're an ANC supporter and you want to keep paying BEE premiums, at least you should want to know how much is being paid. And certainly the IFP, FF+, DA, PA, that grouping should be 100% pushing for transparency of BEE premiums, which they can do both through the departments that they run, the cities and municipalities that they run, which is going to become an increasingly big issue this year, and through their roles in Parliament and in oversight committees. The third point and the final point in terms of IRR Legal's engagement with Treasury and Parliament is that we got Treasury to explain how do you classify BEE premiums in the appropriation process? Every year you have to appropriate the money that gets spent. And Treasury said they do it as goods and services, not subsidies. And that's illegal because according to the 2009 guidelines, which are enshrined in law, the difference between a subsidy and goods and services is whether it's requited or unrequited. Now, this might sound confusing, but think about this. It's fairly simple. If the government pays for something and gets something directly back in return, that is a requited payment. It pays for a car, it gets a car. It pays for lawyers, the lawyers do the work. That's a requited payment. That's goods and services. Now, government can also spend money and not get anything back directly. It just gets what it thinks is good for the country. So, the government subsidizes the busing system. It gives some bus company an extra 10 million rand, and that helps the bus company keeps its prices down when it's moving people around, or it does a bailout for its state-owned enterprise. It's writing off debt. It gets nothing directly in return for that. Those are unrequited. When you pay a BEE premium, by definition, the goods and services have already been taken care of. What you're paying for extra is the BEE component. And, according to Treasury, that's good for society. Without arguing about that, the point is it's not a value that's going directly back into the pocket of the government. So their definition is illegal according to the relevant legislation. And it obscures transparency because the rules on appropriations for subsidies are much more stringent than the rules for appropriations of goods and services in terms of how you report on it at a very high level. So it's no surprise, in fact, that they've made this mistake because it helps cover up the cost of BEE premiums. And the weirdest thing about it, and it's actually a pretty shocking thing, is that it creates a race market on paper at the center of the state because they're saying that being Black literally is a good and service. So that like if you buy 20 BMWs for the police to do high-speed chases from a white person or Chinese person or an Indian person or whatever, then that's one kind of goods. But if you're buying it from a Black person, it's a different kinds of goods that can cost 25% more. So it's making race into something that you can buy or a service that you can buy, which I think really runs against how most people want to think about this. I mean, who really wants to be in a country where you're selling your race to the government and the government's willing to set aside, a quarter of its annual procurement spending to buy race as a good and service? It's pretty mad. Okay, so we think that mad system should change, should remove BEE premiums, and you should cut VAT. And the two really go together for a revenue neutral stimulus that in every economy where it's been tried to do a radical VAT cut, it has stimulated economic growth of the sort that grows jobs. And that's, after all, the number one preference that people have. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much. Back to you, Terence. Terence, you're muted, I'm afraid.
Okay, right. Sorry. Seems that my microphone is working like the Johannesburg municipality. Very late to come to the party. Okay. I would like to first of all, I'd like to thank Gabriel for that. I think you've given us a very good economic and political and also a philosophical picture of what's at play. Let me just put one of the questions, or a couple of questions that appear here in the comments. One of our viewers comments that the survey poll results without information on group demographics is useless. How would you respond to that critique?
I think useless is probably an exaggeration. I didn't mention this, but the case is that for all of those survey results, the numbers are fairly similar, whether you look at the overall results or whether you look at the breakdown by race. I assume by demographic he means race and not age or class or gender. But just to focus on one, so like if you look at the value for money procurement one, I think the biggest difference really is when you ask people, do you want value for money only or value for money plus race as a tiebreaker or BEE premiums? If you look at that only for Black respondents, then the overall picture is basically the same, where it's like 20%, roughly speaking, are willing to pay BEE premiums and 80% want value for money. But within the value for money group, there's a different split. It's roughly half want value for money and half want value for money with a racial tiebreaker. Whereas if you look at the overall population within that, it's slightly more want value for money without a tiebreaker and fewer want it with a tiebreaker. But other than that, those numbers are pretty much the same within race groups as they are across race groups.
Right. I think it's also important to bear in mind that the tax base, as we hear, is not solely comprised of sort of your middle class and above. Very, very poor people, when they spend whatever discretionary money they have, they are contributing to, above a small basket of zero-rated goods. Another comment. Interesting that with a fixed budget, BEE premiums result in less products or fewer products getting bought. To which our CEO says that's a key insight. The consequence that ordinary South Africans, most of whom are Black and most of whom are poor, are receiving fewer goods and worse services from the state than they should be. The shortfall of money being diverted to companies doing business with the state, which earns a BEE premium. There's something quite perverse about this, I would say. Gabriel, do you have any further comments on this one?
Yeah, I think it is a key insight. I think John has summed it up very well. I think I would just add that like the idea in the 90s, the argument in the 90s was that you have a supply chain feeding into the government of established white businesses with credit lines, with brands that have been well established, and in some cases with white racist crony capitalist kind of cabals in connection with the government. And in that kind of environment, it's very hard for an emerging Black business to get in there and compete fairly. And so paying the premium, at like a local level would allow a new business to come in and do the pothole filling service or, some kind of thing where the revenue for the business is going to be like pretty small, but it'll be something. And the idea was that if you allow that premium to be spent so that those businesses can get in, that is actually going to have an economically positive benefit because it's going to break the monopolistic or oligopolistic cartel that is ultimately inefficient. I mean, apartheid was had its own inefficiencies in the supply chain. Whatever you think about that argument at the time, it's really important to look at the fact that now the vast majority of contracts by value are going to majority Black-owned businesses and have been doing so for many, many years, because that shows that argument no longer makes any sense. So, I think John is pointing out, and Armin is pointing out, like there's this huge cost, which is really perverse, that poor ordinary South Africans are getting less goods and services because of the BEE premium system. Maybe once upon a time there was some kind of reasonable reason to do that, to pay that cost. There's now no longer any reasonable reason to pay that cost. It should certainly be eliminated.
Another comment, which just relates something that you said. Shocking revelation that BEE premium is hidden under goods and services. Well, I'm sure that there wouldn't be much disagreement with that. But yes, the idea that that we are paying these premiums, but they are not being discretely measured, and therefore we can't account for for any sort of cost-benefit ratio. That too seems to me to be rather perverse.
Yeah, it is. It's really. I mean, I think that part of the reason that the Zondo report was so helpful. I was a big skeptic of the Zondo report, but in volume 1, it does a systematic analysis, legal analysis of state capture and its connection to BEE. And it begins by going through this sort of tension between what it calls the transformative goals of Section 217.2, which have been interpreted as BEE, and the value for money requirements of 217.1 of the Constitution. And it said there's, like, quote, an inevitable tension when you're trying to do two things at the same time. And until then, I think a lot of commentators would do this thing of saying, well, we're not even really trying to do two things at the same time, because when we pay more to use a black BEE business than another business, we're not really paying more for the same thing, because we're also achieving this other goal that's part of the cost. And the Zondo report said, no, look, if you're going to do good accounting and good auditing and good bookkeeping and good corruption busting, you have to draw lines and you have to be clear about it. Like, this is value for money, this is the extra. And if you can't draw a clean line about which is which, then you're going to create a fuzzy zone that criminals are going to take advantage of time and again.
Right. No, absolutely. Again, from Dr. Endres, political parties compete for votes. Why is no party latching on to cutting taxes as a campaign message? I find that puzzling. Your best assessment.
I think the answer is very straightforwardly that the political parties think the only way to campaign for cutting taxes is with a right-wing monarchist libertarian message. Like, government is bad. And if you look in America, you can see what those kinds of campaigns look like. Some guy with a gun sort of shooting a mascot of the government. Here we go now. We're going to cut taxes. And people, they don't want to play that message. Just setting the South African flag on fire, not even as themselves, but being like the ANC is doing that, caused a huge backlash for the DA. So I think that Fukuyama's analysis is that a lot of South Africans are stuck, not ordinary South Africans, but politicians and media commentators are stuck inside this Cold War way of thinking, where it's either we love taxes and big government, or we hate taxes and we want a tiny government. And both of those messages don't really work very well in South Africa, because actual South Africans live in a very different place to the Cold War. Actual South Africans live in a place where, for a long time, the government helped them a lot. So they over the last 30, 40 years, the government's made huge strides in improving people's lifestyles. So this idea of the government's terrible doesn't quite work. But the idea of the government should get more money now also doesn't work, because everyone knows that the extra that's coming on top of everything that's been is worse, not better. And so the message has to be, I think, a much less ideological one, and one that's actually focused on value for money, which is not ideological. It's just common sense across those ideological divides, that if you're not getting bang for your buck, you should spend less.
Yeah, well, I remember a couple of years ago I was on a television show talking about the private provision of goods and services, and point I made is that I think that we are beyond the point where this is an ideological discussion. The state has simply proven, and as we see, particularly at local government level, that it does not have the capacity to meet even the goals that even the sort of minimalist goals in many cases. So your choice is not sort of an abstract between a virtuous public good and a money grubbing capitalist, but between something being done and something not being done. I think that we are rapidly approaching the end. Let me just conclude by asking you, Gabriel, what would your message be to people listening to this? How do we take these things, these messages forward?
So I think one thing IRR Legal has been engaging with parliamentary oversight committees to say, the Appropriations Committee, the Standing Finance Committee, all of these committees are supposed to be playing this role of, at the very least, making BEE premiums transparent. And then at the next level, cutting them down if that's, what's in the national interest, which the Zonda report said it's in the national interest. A lot of the, I think the Gandhi line, or whose line was like, the first thing they do is they ignore you. And then the next thing they do is laugh at you. The next thing they do is they get very angry with you. And then finally they agree with you. And a lot of these politicians have been happy to stay with the "we're going to ignore you" line of approach. And I think that's because of insufficient, generalized pressure. So I think one thing to do is if you find whatever way you can to add to the pressure on politicians to confront this question of like, why aren't they offering reduced taxes and reduced BEE premiums as an option? You can do that by, helping the IRR, by helping IRR Legal. If you've got ways to do it, you can do it by reaching out to politicians directly. And I think because it's a municipal election year, that really does start at the ground level. If you've got your ward councillor on WhatsApp, it's not a bad question to ask them. I know this isn't your area as a councillor, but you are part of this political party. What are you guys going to be doing around budget cycle to help us get value for money out of our taxpayer spending? And right. I think that if that message starts percolating from the grassroots up to the pretty high flowers, we will eventually see a change. I mean, I'll just say that lest people get despondent and depressed. Last year, we nearly had a VAT increase, and there was a political fight about it, and it didn't happen. I think with the numbers we're looking at, it is only a matter of time and energy to get the VAT cut that ordinary South Africans deserve.
Right, and if I could just point out that last year there was a fair amount of commentary in the media as a whole, including outlets where one would generally not have expected this, calling into question the inviolability and future of BEE. 5 years ago, that would simply not have been a talking point, completely off the table. So, as someone once said back in about 1995, strange things happen in this new South Africa. Strange and wonderful things. I think with that we can bring this to a close. Those of you interested in looking at the report in more detail, please go to irr.org.za, click on the reports tab, and it will take you there. Those interested in the polling, you can find that in a polling report, pro-growth or pro-poverty, findings of the IRR polling 2025, report 3, race and race relations, which is available on the same site. And with that, a wonderful day to everyone further, and live free. Bye-bye.